Welcome to another program of the Rhinebeck Historical Society. My name is Mike Frazier. I'm one of the board members of the Historical Society. Delighted to be back in person with everybody. We've been on Zoom for quite a long time, been able to maintain our monthly programs despite the pandemic, and we'll continue to be doing, as I just said a moment ago, some of our programs via Zoom in the coming months. This evening's presenter is somebody who has presented a couple of other programs for us in the past. One almost 2 years ago, we had a program here that was jointly presented by our speaker this evening and our president, David Miller, which was a journey up the Hudson River. And it was a journey using Bartlett prints and a variety of scenes that were painted or illustrations, and it was a nice way to learn about the Hudson River, a trip from New York to Albany. Bonnie Wood's other presentation here was in November of 2022, and that was about a native of Rhinebeck, Dorothy Knapp, who was an illustrator, did what are known as cachets, covers for envelopes. These were postage stamps that she illustrated for the U.S. Post Office. So we had that program presented by Bonnie. Some of you may be familiar with Shookville, a little northeast of the town of Rhinebeck, and there's a Pomeroy marker there that is there as a result of Bonnie's work with the town, and it memorializes a church and a cemetery in that area. She's also been involved with resurrecting a stone in a cemetery up in Red Hook, and that is from a world-renowned opera singer, Miss Madame Anna Bishop, who married into the Schultz family, and as a result of Bonnie's work, that stone is being resurrected. She's here tonight in her role as an educator who has done some serious research about another educator here in Rhinebeck, one of our most famous educators. And as somebody who's a retired educator myself, I'm delighted to present Bonnie Wood.
Thank you very much, Mike. Welcome. Welcome. When I first started this research, I knew that DeGarmo of DeGarmo Institute was influential as an educator of many of the most successful individuals in Dutchess County history. While researching, DeGarmo inspired me to share his life's works and his words. Join me on this journey of discovery. It is filled with courage, leadership, and a few surprises. The presentation is divided into 3 sections. We've got the early years of DeGarmo's life, the middle, and the later years. What was his heritage? We'll begin right at the beginning. James Marshall DeGarmo. His book, The Hicksite Quakers, The History of the Hicksite Quakers and Their Doctrines, was dedicated to his Quaker parents, his noble Quaker father and his sainted Quaker mother. They're buried in this beautiful stone at the Crum Elbow Rural Cemetery. Peter and Sarah DeGarmo. Here it is, the Crum Elbow Rural Cemetery. The meeting house, Quaker meeting house, is on the far left, and the gravestones for the DeGarmo parents and 3 of their children are in the second row on the right. Quaker. Dr. Shadrach Ricketson's 1831 map is shown here to aid us in visualizing the concentration of Quaker meetings in Dutchess County. By the way, these are the original spellings on the 1831 map. You may see some little different than what you might see today. The ones that I've put there, the blue arrow, are Poughkeepsie, Crum Elbow, and Oswego. He did attend some of the other meetings, but these seem to be the most frequent that mentioned. Here is Elias Hicks. And of course you heard me say Hicksite, and that's where the Hicksite came from. Though this booklet documents Hicks' speaking tour through Dutchess County in the summer of 1829, before DeGarmo's birth, Hicks influenced DeGarmo. Young James' voice within developed in his parents' home and the meeting house. Hicksites emphasize the role of the voice within, or the inward light, in guiding individual faith. Here's the Oswego meeting house. The DeGarmo family attended meeting at the Oswego meeting house in Moores Mills. James taught at a school, a Quaker school in the vicinity, for a brief period. The Bull's Head, Oswego, Friends Meeting, now on Bull's Head Road in Clinton Corners, is open on Sundays. As a part of my preparation, I did all the research, I also had the privilege of spending a lot of time on the road around Dutchess County, going to different places that were significant in DeGarmo's life, to kind of relive that a little bit. And one of the places that I did go was to the location, not this location, but to the location that was here on Bull's Head Road, and spent a Sunday morning there experiencing the quiet time, and then speaking with elders after that about the history of Quakers for that meeting house. So that was a fascinating start to some of the research. And how did the farm and hamlet shape him? James lived and worked on the DeGarmo family farm located in the town of Poughkeepsie in the hamlet of Whippleville. And here you can see Whippleville. And of course I wanted to make sure we could see Poughkeepsie as well. You can see it's a little bit, it's close to Pleasant Valley. And on some of the deeds it actually says that it is in Pleasant Valley. I also went down to look at some of the ancient documents in Poughkeepsie and found 2 deeds for Peter DeGarmo. Peter DeGarmo's purchase that added up to approximately the 100 acres that we'll see in a moment. In 1798, the hamlet of Whippleville was named for the first owners of the mills, Amos and Lydia Whipple. In 1831, James Taylor bought the mill and named the hamlet Rochdale, after his hometown in England. I noticed on my tour there, my driving tour down of Rochdale, that there is still a Whipple Way in this area. Following Charles Miller's driving tour, he didn't call it a driving tour, but it certainly was good for a driving tour. He calls it the history of Rochdale, but he was so detailed that I could travel, and Denise Burns was with me as well. She's here today, traveling down there to discover Rochdale, and this was a wonderful tour. And I saw there the site of the farm where James DeGarmo grew up, And then I went a second time after going to Poughkeepsie to actually see the documents to just confirm that that definitely was the location, was able to speak to the current owner a little bit about it. It is possible that the site where the house now stands was the site of the original barn. It was not the site of the original house, the DeGarmo house. And the images that are here, these were shared by the current owner of the mill, the carriage house by the mill. The house there on your left, that is what it looks like now, and then of course we have two here. They're all undated, and we believe that they were all taken by Charles D. Miller, who wrote the history there. Some evidence of the mill remains. Here, the Rochdale Well still stands in front of a house near the road. The smaller image is of the well-worn stone in front of the well. Behind the well, the Rochdale General Store is still recognizable as a store, but it is a private residence. Bricks from the mill. The mill is not the way it was at that time. There are remnants there of the original mill. But the bricks are very common. You can find those in the area. And here we have a walkway at the carriage house that was made from the bricks from the mill. On the image here of the Wappinger Creek, a bit of state land adjacent to where the old mill stood can be used to approach the Wappinger Creek. At this point, I saw the island that necessitated the building of two dams there rather than one on the Wappinger Creek. The water was rushing, and I could imagine the power that was used to operate the Rochdale Mill. All of this would have been just right there, very close to where James DeGarmo lived. And this would certainly be a very regular place for him to be. So it's good to experience that. Here is from the Poughkeepsie Public Library District, shared this image of the Wappinger Creek Dam. A lot of information here. This agriculture census in 1860 is a fascinating breakdown of the Peter DeGarmo farm. The 100-acre farm, and you can see over on the left, we see the acres, 100 acres. We see the value of the farm, and you can see a lot of interesting things. We see some livestock, we see the bushels of wheat, of Indian corn, a lot of, I did type this here so you can see it a little bit better on the census, but this is all very clear and a great resource to find out about the farm. And then it continues, some Irish potatoes, pounds of butter, value of the animal slaughtered. So imagine being able, it was definitely an asset to my research to find this. Exciting times. Here, this is a Rhinebeck fair. 48 years old, James Marshall DeGarmo, right? This is when he's all grown up. 48 years old. He is invited to give the annual presentation, annual speech at the Rhinebeck Fair. He arrives. There are 7,000 people on the ground. Professor James DeGarmo had precious memories of being a farmer's son, and he expressed those memories. As a result, he then proceeded to plead with the farmers to educate their sons. He believed that the sons would then come back to the farm with their knowledge of classics and cultures and all that they learned in a formal schooling and come back. And that's what he wanted. He wanted the farms to pass down in the families. One man stood up at the end of the presentation and he mumbled that James DeGarmo should not be giving advice to the farmers. However, he should be giving advice to the farmers' wives on how to raise their daughters. Here we have back to when he is a young man again, and he is 11 and he's attending school. He stopped his formal education at 11 years old, and then he returned at 17. Note that Elizabeth is 19. Perhaps Lizzie had some influence on James's continued education when he had to stay home. His formal education continued when he was 17. James wrote about how boys and girls in the Quaker schools received the same education with the same challenges. So for him, that was the natural way. That was the way that he experienced. You might think, well, he's pretty young, and we're already going into the middle years. But it's important to realize that he really grew up fast. What he does now in his early years is remarkable. How did he develop his craft? Dutchess Academy in Poughkeepsie. Professor William McGeorge was his teacher. DeGarmo likely never realized, never anticipated how successful he would be as an educator. He would receive an honorary degree, the Master of Arts from Princeton, and an honorary degree, Doctor of Philosophy from Hamilton College. Interesting. Just this brief announcement in the Red Hook Journal, 1899. By the way, there were so many bits of information that were gathered during this research, and unfortunately we don't have time for everything this evening, so I had to pick out certain things, but certainly all of that will probably be used in a future project. But this is one that struck me because here we have Cornelius Vanderbilt. And what do we do with this? Should I research more? There's always that question. What thrilled him? This quote comes from DeGarmo's book on the Hicksite Quakers. DeGarmo developed confidence and learned to speak his mind from the experts, recognized abolitionists and women's rights activists and social reformers. And we see here, one winter's evening, during the thrilling experiences of old anti-slavery times, Lucretia Mott and some prominent friends, the Quakers, sat by the fireside of a humble farmer's family near Poughkeepsie. We don't know who that farmer was. We do not know who that family was. But we do know that this is what DeGarmo experienced. The Liberator. DeGarmo is around 20 years old here. This is March 27th, 1859. The Liberator is an anti-slavery newspaper. It's published in Boston. We have here a letter to the editor written by DeGarmo. It's the anti-slavery cause in New York. And since I know that we are not going to be able to read all of these articles in full, these are just little excerpts, and certainly they're all available for future viewing. So I'll just pick out a few points here. Why did he like the Liberator, this anti-slavery newspaper? He writes in this letter to the editor, I like its abolition principles. I like its position on matters of religion, as well as its stand upon women's equality, temperance, and capital punishment. This is this young man, 20 years old, around that age, right, who's writing this. Imagine a young man who circulated a petition, gathered signatures of those who supported not sending slaves out of New York State. And who signed this petition? He mentions there at the bottom, influential and upright citizens. When DeGarmo wrote this letter to the editor, William Lloyd Garrison, he knew that Garrison was an advocate for the immediate emancipation of all slaves. And here DeGarmo is mentioning, your visit to Poughkeepsie was highly pleasing to the Friends of Emancipation, as far as I know. And then he ends with, we want earnest, honest advocates of emancipation, and they can do a good work. We can infer here that James DeGarmo is an advocate for the Friends of Emancipation, is a friend of emancipation. 4 months later, a little over 4 months later, 1859, DeGarmo once again sent a letter to the editor of the Liberator. This one is very descriptive of what he witnessed. A week in Poughkeepsie. The week began on Monday with the commemoration of Emancipation Day. By the end of that day, the discussion was the ballot for the African Americans. On Tuesday, the State Teachers Association assembled. And here we have Miss Anthony. Miss Susan B. Anthony is here. She offers a resolution for the joint education of both sexes and for the admission of colored children into the public schools. This was none other than Miss Anthony, Susan B. Anthony. And James DeGarmo is there. He's reporting on this. At the end of the week was a women's rights convention. And DeGarmo mentions a little bit about the lawyers, perhaps anticipating they're going to give a little bit of a hard time to the women. And he says, we shall see how they kept their promise to do this. The convention was called to order by Susan B. Anthony, who acted as president. She read a brief appeal to the women of the Empire State in the form of a petition to the legislature asking for the right to vote. There are quite a number of resolutions included in here. We are only going to look at the first one. The first one is resolved that women, like men, have a right to do anything and everything which is in itself morally right. We think about this. This is the history of not only Dutchess County, of course, but the history of America here. And we think about James DeGarmo is witnessing this. He's there as a young man. And not only that, he's reporting on what he sees. And even more, we have the appointing of the chairman, William McGeorge. That, of course, is, it might sound familiar, we were just talking about him being the teacher of James DeGarmo, Professor William. He was a Scottish teacher in Poughkeepsie who was very well known. Miss Anthony then invited anyone, especially the attorneys, to come forward. But they didn't. They didn't. And then possibly the most exciting, maybe not to us, but to James DeGarmo, is the fact that Miss Emily L. Drake of this county spoke at some length, fully endorsing the views of the convention and advocating unqualified equality. Who was Emily L. Drake? Any ideas? That's who he married. And then, how did he end? And I love this ending. He says, "So goes the good work on." So goes the good work on. He ended his report. Five months later, doesn't this seem everything's moving very, very quickly, and it's just amazing how many of these primary documents are available. What's been witnessed by individuals and appearing here in these newspaper articles. Here we have an anti-slavery convention. This is in 1860. This is in the Poughkeepsie Journal. We have three. I have three here for you to view. Three different sources. One is the Poughkeepsie Journal, one is the New York Times, and one is the Liberator. So we're going to take a quick look at all three. The first one here is the Poughkeepsie Journal. Poughkeepsie Journal still mentions William McGeorge, but also mentions W.H. DeGarmo. W.H. is an older brother, James's older brother, and he was appointed vice president. And then we see that James was appointed secretary at the anti-slavery convention. And even more significant, perhaps, is that you see these two names right here, right next to each other. They both presented addresses. Susan B. Anthony and James DeGarmo. And there are other names there as well. But of course our focus this evening is James DeGarmo. Here is the New York Times. Mentions the abolitionists at Poughkeepsie. James DeGarmo is not mentioned in the New York Times. He may have been an unknown entity in New York City. However, Susan B. Anthony is mentioned, and it says that she addressed the audience on women's rights. And then finally, the third view of the same convention. This one is a third member of the DeGarmo family, another sibling, Sister Lizzie DeGarmo. She writes about the convention. She mentioned the anti-slavery friends, including Susan B. Anthony. Her impressions of the speakers at the bottom, she was very impressed. Clearness of insight, and that they carried the conviction to the hearts of their listeners. Why rejoice? I particularly like these sections, these two items here in her writing. She writes, "The meeting was a perfect success, and the friends of freedom have great cause for rejoicing at the gradual spread of the true abolition doctrine. The occasion was truly one in which the soul pours itself out in silent thankfulness to God that such true-hearted men and women still live to bless humanity by their noble efforts in behalf of the downtrodden and oppressed." In behalf of the downtrodden and oppressed. This is Lizzie DeGarmo writing. And she ends her report there's a few words there, and then she ends at the end with "truly yours for the right." Lizzie DeGarmo. Truly yours for the right. What powerful writing we have here from both James DeGarmo and his sister Lizzie. Now we go back to what is he doing? And when he's not at the anti-slavery conventions, he's a teacher. He's living at this time in 1860 with Professor McGeorge, McGeorge's family, and some other teachers. He was taught by McGeorge, and then he worked for McGeorge. 2.5 years later, the Liberator reports that DeGarmo is scheduled to speak at an anti-slavery convention in Ellenville, New York. He is slated to speak at the same convention as Susan B. Anthony. Rally. Friends of justice and impartial liberty in large numbers, for the redemption of the slave and the salvation of the nation. Able and eloquent speakers will address the convention, among whom will be Parker Pillsbury, Ernestine Rose, Susan B. Anthony, Aaron Powell, James DeGarmo, and others. In 1863, DeGarmo lived in Poughkeepsie, and he was a teacher. He no longer lived with Scottish Professor McGeorge. They had at one point spoken of possibly working together to start a school, and they didn't have much success there, so they parted ways, and here we are. Can you imagine that this once was on Livingston Street near the Third Lutheran Church? The new couple, James and Emily Drake DeGarmo, created a home and shared a career in Rhinebeck. He is principal of the DeGarmo Institute, and she is an English teacher. She managed the housekeeping duties for the boarding students as well. This was their life. Now, for some of these slides, you're going to notice on the left some dates. Many of those, most of those, are presentations that DeGarmo makes through the years, and there are so many more than were included here, and also some places, some events that he attended. And soon after, starting the DeGarmo Institute, we have these two, both of them, James and Emily, both joined the Church of the Messiah in Rhinebeck. They both were birthright Quakers. In his book, The History of the Hicksite Quakers, DeGarmo expresses his gratitude to Reverend Olmsted, the rector of the Church of the Messiah. This might be surprising for it to be here, because the book, of course, is about the Quakers and his early years, DeGarmo's early years experience with the Quakers. By this time, this is 1870, Carrie, their oldest child, was born, and some of the records say that Edmund was a son. Edmund was not a son. James DeGarmo's brother passed away when his son was young, so his brother and the wife passed away a few years later. So James DeGarmo and Emily raised Edmund. Edmund attended DeGarmo Institute, and Edmund was also a part of the management of the DeGarmo Institute when he grew up. His name, at the end of the years that DeGarmo Institute was here in Rhinebeck, there were notices in the Rhinebeck Gazette from the bank that money was owed, and 3 individuals were listed. There was James DeGarmo, Emily DeGarmo, and Edmund DeGarmo were all listed on those notices. What do you think the topic is of this speech? This is where he's speaking. Imagine presenting here. Knowing DeGarmo's passion for science, it's not surprising that glaciers and glacial epoch would be his chosen topic here. And of course, there's the couple of items here from the archives and a notice from the newspaper. This is a Vassar Brothers Institute, but you may know this as something else. Now it's known as the Canine Hackett Art Center. Beautiful, it remains. It's a beautiful building. Still can go there for presentations. And on the left here, you see all of these different presentations that James DeGarmo presented at the Vassar Brothers Institute. And I'm sure there are many more. He was very, he presented a lot at the Vassar Brothers Institute. He presented on this book that he published later in 1897. He gave his initial presentation there at the Vassar Brothers Institute. I said before that DeGarmo commented that the Friends provided the same education and challenges for males and females. He followed this example in DeGarmo Institute. A small booklet for 1881 to 1882 at DeGarmo Institute is in the Rhinebeck Historical Society's archives. It describes names, courses, textbooks, and many more details about the DeGarmo Institute. Just one more of the many, many items I was not able to include here. But this here gives a highlight. This is from the report of the Commissioner of Education and House Documents, 1879. And I wanted to be sure to share it because one of the first questions that I get when I mention to some of my friends here in Rhinebeck is, did females attend the DeGarmo Institute? Were there girls there? And yes, there are. Here we have about the same number of male students and female students, and we have 5 instructors male and 5 female instructors. So certainly that's the way he grew up, and that's the way he practiced. This is an interesting receipt, and it is for the Sookleys. And Kitty Sookley attended DeGarmo Institute as well as her sister. This is for tuition, dinner, singing, French. And students of many of the leading families of Rhinebeck and surrounding towns attended, and students further away also, including students from Japan. Knowing his interest in science, you probably won't be surprised that at one time on top of the building there was a telescope on the top of the DeGarmo Institute. And this cute little fellow here, he is in the Rhinebeck Historical Society's archives, and this article is about the Rhinebeck Fair. In the fair, he not only spoke at the fair, as I mentioned earlier, but he also exhibited at the fair. And we have some of the collection of birds. The fair, Dutchess County Fair, was in walking distance of the DeGarmo Institute. Here we have another of the stuffed birds, and we also have one of the 3 letters that are here in the archives. These letters are written by DeGarmo on DeGarmo Institute letterhead, and they specifically talk about the scientific details about the birds. And then you knew that there had to be something about Astor. Many of our presentations here in Rhinebeck mention the Astors, and this one, of course, also mentions the Astors. Here we have Mrs. F.H. Delano. We have a Delano too. She is John Jacob Astor's sister. She purchased this collection of eggs and nests from Arthur Shook in Red Hook and presented it to DeGarmo for his collection. Professor and Mrs. DeGarmo must have been elated to learn that DeGarmo Institute student and teacher Helen Reed Delaporte was elected to the Rhinebeck School Board in 1900. She became the first woman elected to a Board of Education in Dutchess County. And she's at the end of the 2nd row down. And of course, I'm sure you can pick out James DeGarmo, hat in hand, surrounded by students, teachers. I haven't been able to decide whether his wife is in the picture and who she might be. I haven't seen an image of her. Patriotic. All right, I brought back the same image because you can imagine this with flags and stars and stripes hanging, and everything with bunting, everything decorated to cheer for Levi Morton Harrison and give 3 cheers for the retiring presidents. In addition, 1892, he attended the Board of Almshouse Commissioners. He was a commissioner-elect. He never was a commissioner. But as an elect, he toured the almshouse in Poughkeepsie. He toured the premises, then he had the annual dinner, and then he witnessed the residents and the dinner that was provided for them. And that was a holiday dinner, and they could have as much as they wanted. And the descriptions were, it was a fascinating article that I read about that, and all the foods that were there for the feast. He was prominent in Republican Party politics in Dutchess County. In 1894, he attended the last grand rally for Republicans at Farrell's Opera House in Poughkeepsie, and in 1900, Republican mass meeting at Owens Hall in Arlington. DeGarmo had the reputation of being one of the most forceful and convincing speakers. So we've developed a little bit here. We started out when we were speaking of how much he was writing and he was speaking. And now he's speaking very frequently in the area, and not just in the area, even a little further afield. And I found this one a little humorous. If I were to write it, I would just say gone fishing. But these are the words, and I might even stumble over some of those words if you look at them. So we can take a look there at what he's saying. And was he remembering Rochdale? Was he thinking back? Of course, Pleasant Valley is right there. Was he thinking about when he lived there on the Wappinger Creek? The Eternal Heavens. It was presented, he presented it, DeGarmo presented it here at the Star Institute. And I don't have the exact year, but I know that it was after it had already been presented at the Vassar Brothers Institute. And the reason how I know is that unofficial local historian Burton Kuhn described his attendance at this event here in Rhinebeck. It's not looking as good now here. How does the move from Rhinebeck to Fishkill-on-Hudson impact him? He was considered one of the most successful educators along the Hudson River. Rhinebeck was very sorry to see him go. It was an important, titled Important Business Change in Rhinebeck in the Poughkeepsie Eagle News. But DeGarmo Institute Fishkill-on-Hudson was very happy to have him. Rhinebeck did mention, though, that he wasn't going very far, and he certainly wasn't. Now, two beautiful buildings. First, we had the DeGarmo Institute in Rhinebeck, and then we have another beauty here in Fishkill-on-Hudson. A boarding school for boys and girls. First-class accommodations, and a high grade of work. Similarly, as in Rhinebeck, he joined the St. Andrew's Episcopal Church, which was in walking distance of the DeGarmo Institute in what we now call Beacon, the same way that the Church of Messiah is in walking distance of the where the DeGarmo Institute was here. Poughkeepsie Eagle News. Commencement week was packed full of events, and it was certainly a festive week for the community. What a terrific photo of the team and their principal, DeGarmo. DeGarmo Institute had an athletic association, and local newspapers provided a play-by-play for some of the games, and some were quite entertaining. Unfortunately, I couldn't bring those into the slideshow, but we do have this image here of the team, 1897. So when I stood there where the school was in Beacon at the site, you're standing above all of the other buildings on Rombout Avenue. And you can't tell here because I'm standing up on the rise there. And you notice it's a lot shorter. It's only 2 levels here. A fire burned the 3rd level, so only 2 floors remain. The building is an apartment building, and here's a side view, and the 1885 cornerstone still remains. DeGarmo Institute here at this location in Fishkill-on-Hudson was only one of 4 private schools that held classes here over its history. It had a short history in Fishkill-on-Hudson. We've come to later years. How did he adjust to change? Referred to as a pioneer in secondary education, DeGarmo retired from his career of around 30 years. When I first read a newspaper article about James DeGarmo selling life insurance, I didn't think it had any relevance to my presentation. I thought, that's not my James DeGarmo. It didn't seem to be the same person. But then I read a few more articles that kept popping up in different newspapers, and I said, well, I guess that is him. And that was a change. It certainly was a very big change. And you can see here some of the clippings that I've included. And then all of a sudden, we are going back to something that was addressed quite a number of years ago. In 1897, he received a dedication from Ulysses Alsdorf for the DeGarmo March and Two-Step. Ulysses Alsdorf is pictured in this. This is the Newburgh Academy. He's on the left-hand side. It's number 16. I don't think we can see. Well, actually, we can see a little bit. I don't know if you can see, but he's all the way over there on the left. He was the second African American to graduate from Newburgh Academy. His older brother was the first African American graduate, and his younger brother was the third. The sons and their fathers were all talented musicians, and he was just getting started. In 1908, he published the Hudson Fulton Days for the 1909 celebration. Are you familiar with HBO's The Gilded Age? Some of the music was composed by Ulysses John Alsdorf. And you might say, well, are we going off topic here? We aren't. Because I think I went a little bit ahead here. All right, here we go. I held it down too long. I got too excited about the next part here. 1897, the Masons Light Hymn was a collaboration between James Marshall DeGarmo and Ulysses John Alsdorf. DeGarmo wrote the words, and this famous composer, musician of Newburgh, wrote the music. Now, perhaps even more significant is that Ulysses was the grandson of a former slave. Bishop, his former slave was Bishop Thompson. He became a bishop, and his mother, his grandmother, Ulysses' grandmother, Catherine Thompson, this family was a part of the Underground Railroad in Newburgh. What a collaboration for DeGarmo. And these influences throughout his life, from Professor McGeorge to Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony, Ulysses Alsdorf, and many others, DeGarmo listened. Here is just a mention of all of his work with the Masons. He first joined the Masons in Rhinebeck when he was principal, and he continued to attend meetings and give speeches throughout his life. 1897, what a year, 1897. There was one thing after another here as far as monumental events. This is the year he published the history of the Hicksite Quakers and their doctrines that I've been mentioning throughout the presentation. This is where he gathered his speech and his memories of his childhood years. This resource is readily available It's still used and it's readily available. And talking about buildings, the architecture here he is at the Hollywood Inn in Westchester County. He's called upon to speak there about the Hicksite Quakers. And here, 4th of July, he spoke at Thorne Center in Millbrook. 4 years earlier, he was presented in Millbrook at the WCTU. DeGarmo learned and taught and learned in a never-ending cycle from his early years. And here he is at various teachers' associations, including out of county. Yes, in many ways, DeGarmo had golden days in his youth, in his early role as an abolitionist, an advocate for women's rights, and an educator. Yet he continued to develop his understanding in later years. Are these still his golden days? To go back here to the book, The History of the Hicksite Quakers, where he is mentioning about the Quakers' view of slavery. Is it possible that this publication in 1897 recharged his voice within? Here is a letter to the editor of the Poughkeepsie Eagle News in 1898. 1898. And DeGarmo is writing, "It is not uncommon to indicate the progress of certain ideas by the change of words in use among the people. The power of words." He's speaking of the power of words. He's listening. He's learning the value of words. Their power to degrade, to humiliate, and their power to bring dignity. He knows it's going to take time, but yet he doesn't give up. He's called a thinker. He's called a philosopher. He listened. He learned. He knew what was right when he was 20. And now he knew what was right when he was 60. He was still determined to stand up for his belief, to let his inner voice guide him. So goes the good work on. And then he ends in a familiar way. Meanwhile, all hail to the Afro-American sentiment from an old-time abolitionist. The old-time abolitionist still writes. 1898, 40 years later from the articles that we saw in the beginning of the presentation. Here we have in 1900, Lizzie is living with DeGarmo, Emily, his wife, Carrie, his daughter, and James, his son. Through the early years, the middle years, and the later years, family remained at the center of DeGarmo's life. In 1880, the DeGarmos lost Charles, barely over a year old. Emily DeGarmo was buried near their beloved little Charles in 1901 in the Rhinebeck Cemetery. I'll mention very briefly her obituary. She taught school for 50 years. Actually, it says over 50 years. Had 4 children, Quaker parentage, and she was a devoted Episcopalian. Doesn't mention what we knew earlier. Unfortunately, I didn't find any other record of Emily's work, but we know that she had a voice and was willing to support women's equality. How did his life change after his wife passed? His life took a dramatic change. Character building. Now we know that James DeGarmo would certainly be the one to talk about character. And here he's giving a presentation about character building and its relation to Masonry at the Red Hook High School, the laying of the cornerstone. Character building. I read one of the letters that DeGarmo sent to the father of a student. In it, he said that the boy had not been in any fights recently. Then he said, for 2 weeks now, the boy has stopped smoking. And he asked the father if the father could prevent him from smoking at home. Then, and these are just a few little quips from the letter, and at the end he says, I believe I have done him some good. I think that James DeGarmo has certainly done all of us some good. Here, Lizzie passed in 1905. She's buried with her parents there at the Crum Elbow Rural Cemetery. Truly yours for the right. Now, knowing James DeGarmo, we have what an honor. His students, former students from Rhinebeck, from Fishkill-on-Hudson, they invite him down to the Hotel Manhattan, and who's going to give the speech? He decides he's going to give the speech. And his former students, though, were able to make some formal statements. I'm curious what he spoke about, what he said about himself. Sharon, Connecticut. The news, this article, and several of the articles that they had, and by the way, who would ever look in Connecticut newspapers for James DeGarmo? Right? I didn't know where, in this research process, I didn't always know where I was going to find something, and I didn't predict it. But here he is over in Sharon, Connecticut, and he had quite a number of presentations over there. The one that fascinated me was things I do not know. Things I do not know. So the journalist said, well, he spoke about the pathway from birth to death, an inexplicable pathway. Then described how impressed the audience was. And I guess someone mentioned that, well, that however much DeGarmo did not know, he certainly knew enough to impress us. Here you're probably wondering, why would I put this up there? Because I'm sure you can't read it, all of what's there. But this is the front page of the Rhinebeck Gazette. I want to make that point. The center of the front page, I don't know if this is bigger than usual, but it's certainly a noticeable size for the image of James DeGarmo. Funeral services were held in Poughkeepsie, and he's buried right here in the Rhinebeck Cemetery. Here he is. So we have 4 DeGarmos in a row at the Rhinebeck Cemetery. I did walk around a little bit in the vicinity, didn't come up with any other individuals that I could figure out that they were related. So I think it is just these 4. The 2 children There are 2 children that were still alive when James DeGarmo passed. What was his legacy? What was James Marshall DeGarmo's legacy? He was a philosopher, a scientist, a writer, a poet, a public speaker. By the way, I never mentioned, supposedly, he published over 100 poems. I've read 2 of them. I won't get into those. I know. We're right here at the end. He was an educator, guided by his inner voice to serve others. A man of broad culture and a deep thinker. He advocated for women's equality. He was an abolitionist. So goes the good work on. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Bonnie.
You're very welcome.
You know, this is as much about how to do research and how far and wide you sometimes have to go to get the details, to get the facts, as much as a story about somebody who is very important here in Rhinebeck. Questions?
Why did he not go to the Quaker meeting house on Route 199 that we tried to check out?
That was a little, oh, he probably went there at one point.
Mm-hmm.
I would definitely say that he was very active and he was attending many of the meeting houses in the area, and that was certainly one of the ones that was here. And he would go not just to attend, but to also to visit and to be a part of the wider community. And he mentioned that, he talked about his father, and he was a little worried because he was changing from being a Quaker and becoming an Episcopalian. And he said that his father supported him, and then he explained it. He said his father said that if he weren't a Quaker, that he would become, or if he could he said if he could no longer be a Quaker, he would become an Episcopalian. And that meant so much to James DeGarmo about that. But he said, he made one comment about those 2, about Episcopalian and Quaker, and he said that there's a similarity there that you don't see, just thinking about it, you don't necessarily think there's a similarity between the 2, but he says they both have their formalities. And he said in the Quaker, the formality is the silence, the quietude that's there. And in the Episcopalian, it's a very different service, but they both have their formalities. So that's what he said. Thank you, Alice.
Other questions?
Yes, Nancy?
Bonnie, thank you so much for all the hard work I know it's gone into researching this. And it's been very interesting, especially knowing his involvement in Rhinebeck here, and then realizing that he had been down in Fishkill and other places, and yet he was buried here in Rhinebeck.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, it's very interesting when you read the stories about some of the folks who had been his students when he was running the school here in Rhinebeck. There are a lot of people who were very much influenced by him, who mention him in their writings. I mean, I'm thinking of Mandeville Frost, for example. A number of the members of the Frost family who were very prominent here in Rhinebeck. He was a legislator representing the community in the county. But there were other professionals in the community who were classmates of Frost and who were students of DeGarmo's. and he had quite an influence.
When I first started the research, I was thinking that I would be spending a lot more time researching everything that was happening right at the DeGarmo Institute. And I mentioned the pamphlet. And there is a lot that's available. But then once the anti-slavery came up, I knew that that had to be captured immediately. Some of those, most of those, 2 of the articles I had seen before. The other ones I had never seen before, and I thought that needed to be done. Not to say that we shouldn't also bring forth all of that other information about the DeGarmo Institutes, especially for families. Families want to see their relatives. I know that I was contacted by somebody, and they said that their relative had graduated, and I was able to show them a little part of that booklet that I mentioned. But there is a lot more available. You know, as I mentioned, there was a lot that was taken out and that could certainly be explored.
Why did he move the Institute from Rhinebeck to Fishkill? Was that?
The best, I cannot say 100%, but at that time there were articles in the newspaper from banks, notices from banks, not articles, notices from banks about money being due. Yes. Yeah.
And what happened to that building? Did it just go into?
Well, it used to be where the grassy area is, near right where the Third Lutheran Church is, and gradually through the years it was torn down, and eventually the church bought that property.
I see. So it was never reused.
But there are pictures, and I did have one of my original slides, and there were so many that were cut, obviously, to keep this in a manageable amount of minutes here. But one of them was about how long gone. It was an article, a local article about how it was long gone, and it really fell into disrepair. It was really a shame how it did have a couple of purchasers, but they never could totally bring it back. Had good intentions, but couldn't bring it back.
What about the Thompson House? Wasn't the Thompson House in pretty much the same spot?
The Thompson House, no, the Thompson House is where the hospital was, and before that it is where the parsonage was. So it's a little closer to where we are now. In the west, it's west of where DeGarmo Institute was. If you walk down Center Street and you're facing Third Lutheran, you'll see the one to the left of where the offices are for Third Lutheran. It's likely, because I held up the picture of the DeGarmo Institute and walked down there, and it's very possible that it was actually a little bit where the offices were. And there. And when you look at some of the pictures of DeGarmo Institute, it appears that, I was thinking initially it was the house immediately to the west of the church, but actually it appears that that was a carriage house. So there was probably a carriage house in between there.
Right?
Yeah, as an Italian American, I'm curious to know about his name, because DeGarmo to me seems like an Italian name.
He was a French Huguenot. And interestingly, it was only a few generations back, his father's side. They came as French Huguenots, and he was described as a small, weak child. And he was sickly at times, and also it was said, well, something about he was similar to his father in the French Huguenot line of his father, and went on all about the French Huguenots. You never know.
I think we're going to, unless there's one more question, I think we're going to call it an evening, and thank you, Bonnie, very, very much.
Thank you.